Good morning and welcome to the Grim. I'm your host, Kristen. On today's episode, we'll be opening the gate and entering Greyfriars Kirkyard, located in Edinburgh, Scotland. So grab your favorite mug, cozy up, and let's take a dig into history. Last week, I promised you listeners a fantastic graveyard, after episode 11 took a very different path on the Grim. We're back, and this week's gate opening is quite the famous in Gothic architecture, but also in the paranormal community. Opening Greyfriars Gate was quite an internal struggle for me, as the history of this graveyard is as lengthy as its years in age, but also fearing I might not be able to do it justice. Before I do, it's also good for listeners to know Kirk is Scottish for church, used throughout this episode. Thus, a kirkyard is a churchyard, or graveyard, as many know it by, and now in clearing that up, we can begin. First established in 1620, next to the Greyfriars Kirk from royal sanction, Greyfriars was to replace the kirkyard at St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. For those unfamiliar with St. Giles in the city of Edinburgh, it's located near the heart of the city, making it not the ideal kirkyard for many reasons. The royal decree stated because it is thought beneficial that there should be no more burials within the church, i.e. St. Giles, and because that kirkyard is not thought to have sufficient room for burying the dead, and taking into consideration the smell and the heat of summer, it would be provided by the council that a burial place much further from the middle of town, such as Greyfriars Yard, and the same should be built up and made secure. The number of souls interred within is unknown from mass graves, forgotten grave sites, and also the Governor's prison on the grounds. The Greyfriars Kirkyard gets its name for the Franciscan friary from the church whose friars wore grey robes. The friary was dissolved around 1558-ish, but the name buried in tradition stayed. History unbeknownst to this hallowed ground was about to occur. In 1638, the National Covenant in the kirkyard started where thousands of Scottishmen pledged to resist the changes imposed by Charles I. Charles and his father James VI oversaw church organization and the doctrine, something followers of the covenant disagreed with. They believed themselves to have a covenant or an agreement with God within their faith, following the Presbyterian structure, and the primacy of the church leaders in religious affairs, effectively starting one of the three wars of the Three Kingdoms, or better known as the British Civil Wars. This signing in the kirkyard was a huge milestone in Scottish history. Even later in 1838, an oil painting by William Allen, president of the Royal Scottish Academy and master of the Trustees' Academy, was created to mark its significance. This painting now hangs in the City Art Centre in Edinburgh. After the signing, the Covenanters took control of the Scottish government, eventually leading to events that caused Scotland to become part of the British Commonwealth. I'm painfully and obviously cutting out many huge other parts within these years that led up to Scotland's addition, but this waylays into huge historical events away from Greyfriars Kirk that I suggest listeners look into on their own. It's extremely hard to cut out easily just Greyfriars Kirkyard's history, as much of it was involved within many major historical events in Scotland, but also the world at the time. I feel Scottish history is often overlooked by British in history classes, sadly, but the country had so much influence and partake in historical events. It's something that makes Scotland quite the unicorn in history, fittingly similar to their national animal. Back to the Covenanters in Greyfriars Kirkyard years later, after the signing in 1679, saw the defeat of the militant Covenanters at Bothwell Brig. By this time frame, the Scottish army was defeated in a failed attempt to invade England, and Charles I had been executed back in 1649, just to give you a wide idea of the significant events. Around 1,200 Covenanters were taken prisoner after the defeat in the Battle of Bothwell Brig in June, and left imprisoned in a field just south of the kirkyard. This area of the kirkyard is now known as Covenanters' Prison. Many were left for several months in the area until they were finally transported to the colonies in November. Being a prisoner back in these times led many to be severely abused, to be malnutritioned, or led to death, and many of those in charge just didn't care. Each prisoner was allotted just 4 ounces of bread a day with no shelter. Conditions were so inhumane that the Governor's prison is often described as the world's first concentration camp. Sometimes citizens were kind enough to give them more food, but rarely. Anyone who fought or sided with the Covenanters were recognized as rebels or traitors, leading into a repression called the Killing Time in Covenanter history. This led to some dying in the field, others were put on trial, then executed for treason, and yet others were set free if they agreed to sign a bond of loyalty to the crown. All those who were persecuted and died for their support of the National Covenant during these tragic times are commemorated by the Martyrs' Memorial on the northeastern wall of the kirkyard. When within the grounds today, Covenanters' Prison, which was acclimated into the kirk in the 18th century, now has vaulted tombs. These didn't exist nor were established when the grounds were used as a prison. The vaulted tombs are now known as enclosed burial lairs and used to deter against grave robbery. They can easily be spotted, characterized by solid stone walls or iron railings, served as protective burials for the resting places of the deceased. Greyfriars, like many other kirkyards during its time in the 18th century, dealt with issues of grave robbery. In the 19th century, the kirkyard used a technique that featured 2 low iron cages over the graves. They were leased to the family to safeguard the bodies from grave robbers to ensure the sanctity of the deceased. Known as mort safes, after the body passed the time useful to grave robbers, they were then removed and reused again. This technique is famously photographed and occasionally makes its rounds on social media from time to time, being misled from many as a form of vampire hunting or other widely various theories. Helping visitors to know the full history of the grounds, there's a plaque in the graveyard explaining to visitors where the Covenant Prison section name comes from and a small tidbit of its history. The prison was open to the public till around 1990, when it was locked by the City of Edinburgh Council. This is sadly due to vandalism and drug users finding refuge in the tombs. The area is now only accessible during the day by special arrangement with the guides of the Greyfriars Kirk or at night with a ghost tour. Graveyards can often claim hauntings, but not many a poltergeist. Greyfriars Kirkyard, however, can and has. Located on the left-hand wall of the Greyfriars Kirkyard when you enter from the main gates, lies the Black Mausoleum, and interred within is Sir George Mackenzie of Rose House. Sir Mackenzie was a lawyer and Lord Advocate during the rule of Charles II, and quickly earned a reputation as one of the most vicious prosecutors of the Covenanters. His brutal and callous take toward protesters was legendary and had them imprisoned in Greyfriars. His reputation eventually earned him the name Bloody Mackenzie, from allowing guards to beat and torture prisoners much to his own delight. Many subjects, after being tortured, had their heads placed up on a spiked gate, letting all see their grim fate and what might become of others. Oddly enough, his interment at Greyfriars within the Black Mausoleum famously is not just for his cruelty in life, but also his actions in the afterlife. Many visitors prior to the Black Mausoleum being locked experienced poltergeist activity and even after. Now, before I go into the activity experienced, I think you listeners, if you don't, need to know the difference between a ghost and a poltergeist. Most commonly, a ghost is a soul or specter of a person who's passed on, usually believed to inhabit the netherworld and capable of returning in some form to the world of the living, where a poltergeist is a disembodied spirit or supernatural force credited with certain malicious or disturbing phenomenon. Mackenzie in death even seems to attempt to torture his visitors in delight near or within the Black Mausoleum. That's why the activity surrounding and in the Black Mausoleum has rightly been called a poltergeist. Accounts reported of being pushed, scratched, and feeling nauseous to the point of passing out have occurred. Tour guide Jan Andrew Henderson came forward saying 49 visitors on his ghost tour of the Covenanters' Prison over the course of 8 months had some sort of paranormal experience that occurred during their walking tour, experiencing the feeling of being watched, touched, and cuts or scratches to their faces. One visitor was quoted saying, "It felt as though there was a hand over my mouth. I couldn't see anything," she said. Then when I started to feel faint, and the next thing I knew I was away sitting on the ground. Everyone was asking if it was all right, but I was really confused. The next morning, I woke up with a bruise on my left cheek and my neck. I couldn't believe it, as I wasn't aware of hurting myself when I fainted. I started feeling as though it must have been something to do with the ghost. There's also a tale of a schoolboy who hid inside the Black Mausoleum one night to avoid a beating from a master at George Herod's school and came out insane after encountering whatever might be within. Swirling rumors of what has been nicknamed the Mackenzie poltergeist and its activity caught the attention of Colin Grant, a minister of a spiritualist church and the owner of a clairvoyant shop on St. Mary's Street in Edinburgh. In November of 1999, Grant, armed with a candle, cross to ward off evil entities, and a Bible, decided Greyfriars needed an exorcism. Accompanied by the local press, Grant claimed he finally cast out the evil spirits trapped within the kirkyard for centuries. The ritual wasn't without an appearance, though, of what perhaps most believe is Bloody Mackenzie. Behind Grant near the end of the ritual, a dark shape was witnessed gliding across a window in the kirk, even though it was locked and no one was inside, turning many of the non-believing press into believers very quickly. Grant's efforts, though, seemed to be in vain, as 2 months later more reports of activity were made. Around the same time frame in January, Grant expressed fears his work might just kill him, and sadly on the 26th he passed away during a seance in his clairvoyant shop of a heart attack. Whether Grant's death was a result of the exorcism or from natural causes is up to the listener to decide. In the course of history of the poltergeist activity, it took a drastic increase around 1998, when a homeless man took shelter in the Black Mausoleum. He ended up meddling with one of the coffins in the tomb, causing the floor to give way and collapse beneath him into an ancient plague pit below. Many paranormal experts believe this event disturbed Mackenzie, leading into his unwelcoming attacks on visitors. In 2003, two teens decided to try their luck robbing Mackenzie's tomb of his skull, but were discovered by a ghost tour on the grounds. The boys were caught playing soccer with the skull and charged with the ancient law of the violation of a sepulchre, meaning to disturb a dead person, which can be punishable by life imprisonment. The judge handling the case described it as revolting, but the boys were convicted and given probation, rather than a one-way ticket to Australia as many grave robbers in the past were. At the very least, around 350 people have claimed to have been attacked by Mackenzie's various spirit, with more likely to come. Marking the site where hundreds were beheaded or buried near the grass market stands the Martyrs' Memorial, commemorating around 18,000 Covenanters who died for their beliefs. Per political tradition, most were beheaded and then their heads placed on spikes, usually on the gates into Edinburgh. One of the most popular gates was the Netherbow Gate that no longer stands on the top of Canongate in the city. If they weren't placed on the gate, some had their heads, arms, or other body parts sent home to send a message to others who might show interest in resisting the king's will. This memorial reminds visitors of the killing time and the tragedies some went through for their beliefs, sadly, in history. It's an absolutely gorgeous Gothic memorial and one that will haunt its visitors afterward, in beauty and tragedy. If you weren't paying attention or maybe not a Harry Potter fan, some gravestone inscriptions in the Greyfriars might be familiar to many. The names of Potter, Black, Tom Riddle, Moody, Crookshanks, and McGonagall, all from J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, are all permanent residents. The kirkyard served as an inspiration for her characters' names in the novel, and also Godric's Hollow. When you enter, turn right after entering the gates and look toward the left side in the grass area. This is the area that you'll find the tombstone of Anne and Robert Potter, the inspiration for Harry Potter's last name. McGonagall, who Professor McGonagall's name inspiration, was iconically one of the worst poets in Scottish history, and originally was buried in a pauper's unmarked grave. In 1999, an inscribed slab was later installed bearing his name. Alongside its famously interred, when hearing the legends of Greyfriars, it's a must to include Greyfriars Bobby, a statue at the corner of Edinburgh's Candlemaker Row and George IV's Bridge commemorate the adorable pup. The famous legend about the Skye Terrier is known by almost all in Scotland and beyond. Poppy was looked after by a local policeman, John Gray, for the last 2 years of his life. Upon John Gray's death, he was interred in Greyfriars and Bobby guarded his grave for 14 years. Capturing the heart of Lord Provost William Chambers, who commissioned Bobby's statue, he would bring the pup food and anything else he needed at Gray's grave. Throughout Scotland, Bobby's story is famous and even Disney-worthy. When in 1961 they released the film Greyfriars Bobby, the true story of a dog. When he eventually passed away, Bobby was buried just inside the gate of Greyfriars Kirkyard, not far from John Gray's grave. His dog collar can be now found in the Museum of Edinburgh. His headstone was erected by the Dog Aid Society in 1981 and receives many visitors far and wide. Claims of hearing disembodied barking and sightings of a small ghost-like dog in Greyfriars is believed to be Bobby, even in the afterlife protecting John Gray. Many of Scotland's most beautiful mural monuments are located within Greyfriars. Rich in symbolism, they depict themes of immortality and mortality, including Death's Head, the Angel of Resurrection, and the King of Terrors. The tombs, vaults, and gravestones feature skulls and dancing skeletons known as memento mori in Latin, meaning remember you will die, adding what some might consider morbid or macabre imagery to the grounds, but was intentional in the time frame to remind those left behind that life is fleeting and that otherworldly vanities aren't important. European renowned Latin scholar George Buchanan has a large and beautiful memorial on the grounds, but his gravesite is unknown. He was at one time imprisoned by the Inquisition, spending 2 years of his incarceration translating the Psalms of David into Latin. Buchanan was the first to apply the term Celtic to his native Gaelic culture, thus linking the pre-Roman inhabitants of the Iron Age Britain to the Celts of Europe. Upon his return to Scotland in 1561, he embraced the Reformed religion and tutored Mary, Queen of Scots, whom he denounced after the murder of her husband Darnley. Then, in 1567, was appointed the first lay moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. Buchanan in 1570 once again became a tutor to 4-year-old James VI, becoming entrusted to give the young king a Protestant education, effectively turning him against his mother's ideas of rule by divine right. Buchanan died in 1582 and is considered one of the most profound intellectual 16th century Scottish minds. Now, if some of the dates are a little confusing to some of you listeners, I too was a little confused. I began double-checking dates and wondering where I went wrong, as they don't seem to add up with burials within and when the kirk was established, but it didn't. Prior to Greyfriars' actual establishment, the land of the friary passed into possession of Mary, Queen of Scots in 1560, who subsequently granted it to the town council for the use as a burial ground later bordered by the famous Flodden Wall, thus allowing burials prior to its establishment and clearing my confusion. The church adjacent to the kirkyard was to be the first post-Reformation church built in Edinburgh. The build, however, was extremely slow and the kirk didn't open till Christmas Day in 1620. If the year 1620 sounds familiar to Americans, it should. It's the same time frame the Pilgrims landed in the Plymouth colony. In the eastern end of the kirk, an American flag sits that was previously flown at the White House. After the 350th celebration of both historical events, the American consul in Edinburgh presented this flag to the kirk as a gift. When visiting, visitors notice on the outside more than the inside, the kirk appears to have a double porch on the north side of the building. The kirk originally had 2 churches that had separate entrances for each separate congregation, remnants of its old past double congregation life and the religious battles of faith. Yet this isn't the only reason for the double entrance, but from its accident waiting to happen scenario in 1718. For some reason, the town council decided to use a small squat tower to store its gunpowder, and of course it blew up. The west end of the kirk was completely ruined and had a new west wall rebuilt and 2 bays into the church. It also experienced a fire in 1845, destroying the furnishings of the new Greyfriars. Today, visitors can see traces of the fire damage still on the eastern part of the church. Its minister Robert Lee D.D. used the fire to completely change the church and its ways, bringing it to the modern age of religion. The church before was bland, had no hymns and no standing during the Mass and nothing otherworldly. The restoration had the windows made into lancet and stained glass, the first in any Scottish parish church since the Reformation. The stained glass in the Greyfriars is mid-Victorian and was installed as a permanent memorial to the people who in their day occupied prominent positions in the church. The large east window depicts the parables of the prodigal son, the good Samaritan, the Pharisee, and the publican, and the wise and foolish virgin. It became open to art and beauty within the parishioners. Hymns were then sung during Mass, giving it a urethral feel. Lee saw backlash, of course, from officials, but after a few years, his new implementations became the normal for every kirk. Visitors today see the interior that was restored between 1931 and 1938. Where the two churches were combined, arcades were restored, and the ceiling of the California redwood was rebuilt over the 6 bays of the original church. The west end of the church houses a magnificent Peter Collins organ built in 1990 to replace the Hamilton organ that originally sat in the northwest corner. Its 3,400 pipes with a Latin motto inscribed from the last verse of Psalm 150, "Let everything that hath breath praise the Lord," is breathtaking. The kirkyard is wrapped by Edinburgh's famous Flodden Wall. The wall began at the south side of the castle, running south across the west end of the Grass Market, where the Westport was located, and continued uphill across the Vennel. Walls, historically speaking, helped control who or what went in and out, aided battles, and provided safety to major cities. In 1513, the Scottish and British fought at the Battle of Flodden with a heavy defeat, and King James was killed in battle, making many expect an imminent invasion. Thus, the Flodden Wall was constructed in Edinburgh and is now an historical landmark in the city. Greyfriars' partake in history was essential and pivotal. Crossing into its gates is a journey into time, and yet you know you're in the present. It's dark, turbulent, and yet beautifully human. So many buried within are historical significance I haven't mentioned yet either. James Craig, architect of Newtown, poet Alan Ramsay, Walter Scott, father of Sir Walter Scott, George Halliburton, Bishop of Dunkeld, and Adam Anderson, physicist, are just to name a few. I sadly can't give you every single one's history, or this podcast episode might well run over 2 hours. Yet places like Greyfriars are essential to history and their residents' memories remembered. People who stood up for the beliefs, changed history, and how even religion was practiced. Entering and learning how essential their sacrifices to history for what we take granted today can be humbling. Knowing inspiration for even one soul can transform lives from stories worldwide for one place like Greyfriars is invaluable for history. I hope if you ever make it across the pond, or if you live closer, plan a journey to enter Greyfriars gates. The grave grind for Greyfriars Kirkyard was a chai latte from Cohen and Sons in Edinburgh. For more honorary grinds, please visit the-grim.com. For now, we're closing the gate on Greyfriars Kirkyard. I hope you enjoyed our dig into history. If you did, subscribe today to join us next time when we open the gate on the Grim.